The morning air was crisp in Vallecito, Colorado, as Dylan Redwine reluctantly climbed into his father's truck. It was mid-November 2012, and the mountains were dusted with snow, their peaks jutting into a pale blue sky. But the beauty of the surroundings did little to ease Dylan's nerves. He hated these trips, hated being forced to spend time with his father, Mark Redwine. His mother, Elaine Hall, had assured him that this Thanksgiving visit was just a few days. He'd be back soon. Yet Dylan couldn't shake the gnawing feeling of dread. Inside the truck, Mark tried to make small talk. He commented on the weather, asked about Dylan's school, and mentioned a local fishing spot. Dylan responded in monosyllables, his gaze fixed on his phone. The tension between them was palpable, a silent reminder of years of strained relations. Mark's attempts at fatherly warmth felt forced, and Dylan's detachment stung. As they arrived at Mark's remote home, Dylan sent a quick text to a friend. "I'll let you know if I survive." It was meant as a joke, but there was an edge to it that hinted at his unease. The house was a modest, weathered structure nestled among tall pines. Dylan stepped inside and was hit by the smell of old wood and something faintly metallic. He dropped his bag in the living room, noting the clutter, old magazines, empty soda cans, and a couch that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. Mark gave a half-hearted tour, pointing out the kitchen and the bathroom. Dylan had been here before, but it always felt unfamiliar, like a house, not a home. Dinner that evening was awkward. Mark cooked steaks on the grill, over-seasoning them to the point of being inedible. Dylan pushed the food around his plate, wishing he were back in Colorado Springs with his mom and friends. Mark tried to engage him, asking if he wanted to watch a movie, but Dylan shook his head, muttering something about being tired. He retreated to the couch, pulling out his phone and scrolling through messages. As the hours ticked by, the house grew quieter, darker. Dylan noticed Mark moving around, locking a door to a room Dylan had never seen open. "What's in there?" Dylan asked casually, his curiosity piqued. Mark shrugged it off with a nonchalant, "Just storage." But the tension in his voice was unmistakable. That night, Dylan fell asleep to the hum of his phone charger and the distant creak of floorboards. He dreamed of his mother's laughter, of the safety and warmth of home. He didn't see Mark sitting silently in the living room, staring at a framed photo of the family back when things were whole. As the first light of dawn seeped through the trees, Dylan's absence would soon become a haunting question. But for now, the house was still, holding its secrets tightly. The morning sunlight filtered through the trees surrounding Mark Redwine's isolated home, casting long shadows on the frost-covered ground. The quiet should have been peaceful, but instead, it felt ominous. When Mark returned home from a supposed early morning errand, he immediately noticed something unusual. Dylan wasn't on the couch where he had left him. The blanket lay crumpled, his phone was missing, and there was no sign of the boy anywhere in the house. Mark's initial reaction was oddly subdued. He walked around the house, calling Dylan's name in a tone that lacked urgency. He checked the backyard, glanced at the driveway, and muttered to himself before retreating inside. To anyone observing, it might have seemed like he was stalling. Minutes stretched into an hour before Mark finally decided to call Elaine. When Elaine picked up the phone, her heart sank at Mark's detached tone. "Dylan's not here," he said flatly. Panic surged through her as she demanded details, but Mark's answers were vague, even evasive. "Maybe he went for a walk. He likes to explore," he suggested, as if trying to downplay the seriousness of the situation. Elaine's instincts told her something was terribly wrong. Elaine immediately reached out to Dylan's friends, but none of them had heard from him. Text messages sent to his phone went unanswered. By mid-morning, she contacted the local authorities, pleading for immediate action. "He wouldn't just leave," Elaine insisted, her voice breaking. "Something's happened to my son." The search began that afternoon. Neighbors, police, and volunteers fanned out across the area, combing the dense woods and rugged terrain around Mark's property. The local news quickly picked up the story, and the small community of Vallecito was thrust into the national spotlight. Flyers with Dylan's smiling face were distributed, and search dogs were brought in, their handlers moving methodically through the underbrush. As the hours turned into days, Elaine grew increasingly suspicious of Mark. His responses to questions about Dylan's last known movements were inconsistent. "He was asleep when I left," he claimed at one point, only to later suggest he mentioned wanting to go meet a friend nearby. Investigators began noting these contradictions, as well as Mark's detached demeanor. While Elaine was visibly distraught, Mark seemed almost indifferent, even irritated by the growing scrutiny. Adding to the mystery, a neighbor came forward with a troubling observation. Early that morning, they had seen a figure walking away from Mark's house toward the tree line, carrying what looked like a large bundle. The sighting was brief, but it was enough to pique investigators' interest. Police later found tire tracks leading to a secluded area nearby, as if someone had driven there recently. The pieces of the puzzle were piling up, but none of them yet formed a clear picture. Meanwhile, Corey, Dylan's older brother, added another layer of intrigue. In a quiet conversation with Elaine, he hinted that Dylan had recently uncovered something troubling about Mark. He said Dad had some secrets, Corey confided, his voice low. He didn't go into detail, but he seemed really upset. These revelations only deepened Elaine's desperation. She couldn't shake the feeling that Dylan's disappearance was tied to something far darker than a simple accident or wandering off. As search crews continued to comb the area, the first seeds of suspicion began to take root among the investigators. Mark's inconsistent behavior, the neighbor's sighting, and Corey's cryptic remarks painted a picture that was growing increasingly sinister. The search efforts intensified, but the cold November nights in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of Vallecito made progress agonizingly slow. Every passing hour without a clue felt like a lifetime to Elaine. She clung to hope, even as the unease in her heart grew heavier. Somewhere out there, her son was waiting to be found, or so she prayed. The search began with urgency and hope, but the vast wilderness surrounding Vallecito seemed determined to guard its secrets. Volunteers and law enforcement scoured the rugged terrain, their voices calling Dylan's name echoing unanswered through the dense pine trees. Search dogs sniffed tirelessly, their handlers battling against the biting November cold. It was a race against time, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Elaine Hall stood at the command center, clutching a photo of her smiling son, her voice hoarse from repeating the same plea to anyone who would listen. "Please, just find him. He's out there." Her desperation was palpable, and her determination galvanized the volunteers, but the progress was agonizingly slow. Mark Redwine, on the other hand, was notably absent from the search efforts. When he did appear, his demeanor raised more questions than comfort. He seemed detached, almost irritated by the attention. "I've already told the police everything I know," he snapped, when asked to recount his last interactions with Dylan. His behavior didn't sit well with the community or the investigators. Days turned into weeks, and hope began to waver. It was during one of these grim mornings that a cadaver dog alerted near Mark's truck. The handler froze, tension crackling in the air. Additional tests confirmed the presence of human remains. This was the first tangible lead, and it cast a dark shadow over Mark. In June 2013, after months of searching, a hiker made a gruesome discovery on Middle Mountain. Partial remains were found scattered among the rocks, partially hidden by the dense undergrowth. The location was remote, far from where Dylan was last seen, raising the chilling possibility that someone had deliberately moved the remains to avoid detection. Elaine collapsed when she received the news. Her worst fears had been realized, yet there was no closure, only more questions. How had Dylan ended up there? Who had done this? And why? The discovery sparked new momentum in the investigation. A forensic team combed the area, uncovering items believed to belong to Dylan, including fragments of clothing and a torn shoe. The positioning of the remains suggested something deliberate, almost staged. Adding to the growing unease, a hiker came forward, claiming to have seen a man matching Mark's description on Middle Mountain around the time of Dylan's disappearance. This new testimony only deepened the cloud of suspicion around Mark. In 2015, 2 years after the initial discovery, another grim find was made. Dylan's skull. Forensic analysis revealed blunt force trauma, confirming what many had feared. This was no accident. The evidence painted a picture of violence, of a life cut short in the most brutal manner. Back in Vallecito, the town grappled with the weight of the tragedy. Rumors swirled, fingers pointed, and the once quiet community became a hub of national attention. The media descended, their cameras capturing every tear-streaked face and every anguished plea for justice. Yet, through the noise, Elaine's voice remained unwavering. "I just want the truth," she said during a press conference. Her strength was both inspiring and heartbreaking. She had lost her son, but she refused to lose the fight for answers. Mark's behavior during this time only further fueled suspicion. He grew more reclusive, dodging reporters and offering cryptic, inconsistent statements to law enforcement. When asked about the new discoveries, he replied curtly, "I've got nothing to say." But the evidence was beginning to speak for itself. With each piece of clothing, with each bone fragment, the puzzle became clearer. Dylan's story was one of betrayal and violence, and the closer investigators got to the truth, the more it seemed to lead back to the one person who should have protected him the most. The media frenzy surrounding Dylan Redwine's disappearance reached a boiling point as investigators began piecing together an unsettling narrative. Public suspicion was now firmly directed at Mark Redwine, but the true depth of his secrets had yet to surface. Everything changed when Corey, Dylan's older brother, stepped forward with information that sent shockwaves through the case. In an emotional interview with law enforcement, Corey revealed that Dylan had confided in him about something disturbing just days before the fateful trip to Mark's house. "He found some pictures," Corey explained, his voice trembling. "He said Dad was doing things, weird, disgusting things." The officers pressed for more, and Corey reluctantly described the images. Mark, dressed in a diaper, engaging in grotesque acts that defied comprehension. Dylan had stumbled upon them by accident, and the discovery had filled him with both anger and disgust. This revelation added a chilling new layer to the investigation. Prosecutors theorized that Dylan had confronted Mark about the photos during the visit, sparking a violent altercation. "It wasn't just about embarrassment," one investigator later said. "It was about control," and Dylan threatened to expose everything. Mark vehemently denied these allegations when confronted. "This is Elaine's doing," he snapped during a police interview. "She's turning everyone against me, even my own kids." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. Despite his protestations, investigators couldn't ignore the growing mountain of circumstantial evidence pointing squarely at him. The story exploded in the media. News outlets plastered headlines with the grotesque details of the alleged photos, framing Mark as a man consumed by shame and desperation. Public opinion shifted decisively. Talk show panels debated the psychology of a parent who could harm their child, and armchair detectives dissected every clue released by the police. But the revelations didn't stop there. A forensic expert uncovered an unsettling twist. Metadata from the photos suggested they might have been shared online, raising the possibility that someone else in Mark's circle was aware of his behavior, or worse, complicit. Investigators widened their focus, scrutinizing Mark's online activity and his connections, searching for any indication of a larger network of secrecy. Meanwhile, Elaine remained steadfast in her pursuit of justice. "Dylan deserves the truth," she said during a tearful press conference. Her pain was raw, but her resolve was unshakable. "I won't stop until we know exactly what happened." As law enforcement dug deeper, a disturbing pattern emerged. Mark's friends described him as volatile, with a history of outbursts that bordered on violent. One former acquaintance came forward with chilling anecdotes of Mark's temper, recounting a time when he had erupted over a perceived slight. "He has a dark side," the man said. "You don't see it right away, but it's there." The pressure was mounting, and Mark's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He began avoiding public appearances, retreating to his home and refusing to answer calls from investigators. Yet, even as he tried to maintain his innocence, the walls around him were closing in. Each new revelation, each damning piece of evidence, painted a picture of a man desperate to hide the truth at any cost. Despite the overwhelming public interest, the case was far from over. Investigators were convinced there was more to uncover, and the deeper they delved into Mark's secrets, the more horrifying the possibilities became. Dylan's voice had been silenced, but through the tireless efforts of his family and the authorities, his story was finally beginning to emerge, one dark, harrowing piece at a time. The investigation into Dylan Redwine's disappearance had reached a critical juncture. Months of searching had led to the grim discovery of his partial remains on Middle Mountain, but the evidence was fragmented and circumstantial. Investigators needed definitive proof, and forensic science provided the breakthrough they desperately sought. A meticulous search of Mark Redwine's living room revealed faint traces of blood on the couch and nearby carpet. At first glance, they were nearly invisible, but luminol testing illuminated the faint blue glow that spoke of violence. Subsequent DNA analysis confirmed the unthinkable. The blood belonged to Dylan. The finding was damning, but it was only the beginning. In a parallel effort, cadaver dogs had alerted to the scent of human decomposition in Mark's truck. While Mark had claimed he used the truck only for errands, the dog's reaction told a different story. Investigators theorized that Dylan's body had been transported in the vehicle, casting further doubt on Mark's innocence. Adding to the growing mountain of evidence, a forensic expert analyzed the location where Dylan's remains had been found. The position of the bones, combined with the lack of natural animal activity, suggested deliberate tampering. It was as if someone had moved the remains to a remote, inaccessible spot to delay discovery. The chilling implication was clear. Someone had gone to great lengths to conceal the crime. Mark's erratic behavior during this time further fueled suspicion. Surveillance footage surfaced showing him purchasing an unusual amount of cleaning supplies the day after Dylan's disappearance. When confronted, Mark dismissed the footage as irrelevant, claiming he was preparing for routine household chores. Investigators weren't convinced. The timing was too convenient, and the explanation too flimsy. As investigators pieced together the timeline, more inconsistencies emerged in Mark's statements. Initially, he claimed Dylan had been asleep when he left the house, but he later changed his story, suggesting Dylan may have wandered off. Each contradiction tightened the noose around Mark's narrative, painting him as a man struggling to maintain control of his lies. A chilling twist came when forensic analysts revisited the metadata of the photos Dylan had found. The files had been accessed shortly before Dylan's visit, raising the possibility that Mark feared exposure. The idea that Dylan's confrontation over the photos could have sparked a violent outburst gained traction, solidifying the prosecution's theory. Despite the growing evidence, Mark continued to deny any wrongdoing. "You're looking for a scapegoat," he told investigators during a tense interview. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed the fear creeping in. He was running out of explanations, and the evidence was closing in. In the public sphere, the revelations ignited a firestorm. Headlines screamed of betrayal and secrecy, and the court of public opinion had all but convicted Mark. For Elaine Hall, the forensic breakthroughs were both a relief and a torment. They brought her closer to the truth, but also confirmed the horrifying reality of what had happened to her son. Investigators knew the case was far from over, but they were armed with the tools to dismantle Mark's facade. The blood in the living room, the cadaver dog alerts, and the cleaning supply receipts were pieces of a puzzle that, when combined, pointed to one undeniable conclusion. The fight for justice was intensifying, and Mark Redwine was about to face the reckoning he had evaded for so long. The morning of July 22, 2017, was deceptively ordinary. Mark Redwine stood on his front porch, sipping coffee, as the sun crept over the mountains of Vallecito. Inside his home, the air was heavy with tension. Mark's solitude had become a fragile bubble, one that investigators were about to burst. 5 years of mounting evidence had finally led to this moment. A convoy of unmarked vehicles approached, their presence unmistakable. This was no ordinary visit. The knock on the door was firm, unyielding. Mark hesitated before opening it, his face a mask of defiance mixed with apprehension. Detectives stood in the doorway, flanked by uniformed officers. "Mark Redwine," one of them said, "you are under arrest for the murder of Dylan Redwine." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Mark's reaction was as unsettling as it was telling. He didn't resist or protest. Instead, he stared blankly, as if the moment he had been dreading for years had finally arrived. "This is a mistake," he muttered, but there was no conviction in his voice. The officers moved swiftly, placing him in handcuffs before leading him to the waiting squad car. As he was driven away, neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering behind cupped hands. The long shadow of suspicion had finally caught up with him. Elaine Hall and Corey Redwine watched the arrest unfold from a distance, their emotions a volatile mix of relief, anger, and sorrow. For Elaine, this was a step toward justice for Dylan, but it was also a painful confirmation of her worst fears. "I always knew it was him," she whispered to Corey, her voice trembling. The arrest reignited public interest in the case. News outlets quickly picked up the story, with headlines branding Mark as a father who had betrayed the ultimate bond of trust. Social media buzzed with outrage and speculation. People demanded answers, and for many, Mark's arrest was already a conviction in the court of public opinion. Mark's defense team, however, wasted no time crafting a counter-narrative. They claimed the evidence was circumstantial and argued that Dylan's injuries could have been caused by an animal attack. "The prosecution is grasping at straws," Mark's attorney declared during a press conference. "My client is being unfairly targeted." Behind the scenes, the prosecution's case was airtight. The forensic evidence, blood in Mark's living room, cadaver dog alerts in his truck, and the receipts for cleaning supplies painted a chilling picture of a calculated cover-up. But what truly tipped the scales was a new witness, a former friend of Mark's who came forward with startling revelations. This friend described Mark as a man with a dark temper, someone who had once confided disturbing thoughts about his children. He told me he felt disrespected by Dylan, the friend revealed. He said, "One day he'll push me too far." These words, combined with Mark's erratic behavior over the years, provided a glimpse into the volatile relationship between father and son. The arrest marked a turning point for the town of Vallecito. While some residents expressed shock and disbelief, others admitted they had always suspected Mark. There was just something off about him, a neighbor confided to reporters. He kept to himself, but when you talked to him, you could feel the anger underneath. As Mark sat in a holding cell, awaiting his first court appearance, the weight of the evidence against him was impossible to ignore. Investigators were confident they had their man, but they knew the road to justice would be long and arduous. The trial would be a battle of narratives, a clash between cold, hard facts and the desperate attempts of a man determined to evade responsibility. Elaine, meanwhile, prepared herself for the emotional toll of what lay ahead. "This isn't over," she told reporters, "but I will see this through for Dylan." Her resolve was a stark contrast to Mark's silence, his refusal to address the growing mountain of accusations against him. The wheels of justice had been set in motion, and there was no turning back. The world would soon hear the full story of Dylan Redwine, a story of betrayal, loss, and the relentless pursuit of truth. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers as Mark Redwine entered, flanked by his defense team. It was a stark contrast to Elaine Hall, sitting stoically with Corey by her side, both their faces etched with the weight of 5 years of anguish. This trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning. For Elaine, it was a chance to give Dylan a voice. For Mark, it was a desperate attempt to salvage what remained of his life. The prosecution wasted no time painting a damning picture. They presented a narrative built meticulously over years of investigation, blood samples taken from Mark's living room, cadaver dog alerts in his truck, and receipts for cleaning supplies all pointed to a grim conclusion. One of the most compelling moments came when the lead forensic investigator described the evidence with cold precision. The blood patterns suggest a violent event. These stains are not incidental, they tell a story. Elaine's testimony was a turning point. As she took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She recounted the day Dylan disappeared, her voice trembling but resolute. "He didn't want to go," she said, her eyes locked on Mark. "He was scared of you." Her words cut through the air like a knife, leaving the jury visibly shaken. Corey's testimony followed, adding more weight to the prosecution's case. "Dylan told me about the photos," Corey revealed, his voice breaking. "He said he didn't trust Dad anymore." Mark's defense team fought to dismantle the prosecution's narrative. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial and pointed to the harsh wilderness as the true culprit. "This was a tragic accident," Mark's attorney insisted. "There is no direct proof that my client caused Dylan's death." They attempted to sow doubt, suggesting that wild animals could have moved Dylan's remains or that environmental factors might have explained the evidence. But their arguments struggled to hold ground against the prosecution's relentless onslaught. The tension reached its peak when the jury was shown GPS data contradicting Mark's alibi. The prosecution argued that Mark's movements placed him near Middle Mountain during the crucial hours of Dylan's disappearance. The defense scrambled to explain this, but their rebuttals felt weak in comparison to the precision of the data. An unexpected twist came in the form of a surprise witness. A hiker testified to seeing Mark in the vicinity of Middle Mountain, carrying what appeared to be a large, heavy object. "I didn't think much of it at the time," the hiker said, "but now I can't get that image out of my head." This testimony sent shockwaves through the courtroom, bolstering the prosecution's case in a way few had anticipated. Throughout the trial, Mark remained impassive, his face betraying little emotion, but his silence spoke volumes. The jury, as well as the public, couldn't ignore the growing mountain of evidence or the inconsistencies in Mark's story. As the trial drew to a close, the prosecution's closing argument left the courtroom in stunned silence. "Dylan Redwine didn't run away," the prosecutor declared, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "He didn't wander off. He was betrayed by the person he should have been able to trust most in the world, his father." The jury was left with the harrowing task of deciding Mark's fate. The courtroom was a sea of tension as the judge dismissed everyone for deliberation. For Elaine and Corey, it was the culmination of years of pain and persistence. For Mark, It was the moment his carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The courtroom was silent as the jury returned, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and gravity. Elaine Hall sat rigidly, her hands gripping the edge of the bench, while Corey stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched in anticipation. Mark Redwine, flanked by his defense team, appeared stoic, though his darting eyes betrayed an undercurrent of dread. This was the moment everything had been leading to, the culmination of years of investigation, heartbreak, and a trial that had gripped the nation. The four-person stood, cleared their throat, and read the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant Mark Redwine guilty of second-degree murder and child abuse resulting in death. The words seemed to echo in the courtroom, each syllable a blow to the man now convicted of killing his own son. Elaine let out an audible gasp, tears streaming down her face as she clutched Corey's hand. Across the room, Mark slumped slightly, his composure cracking for the first time. The sentencing phase was swift. The judge delivered a sentence of 48 years in prison, a decision that brought a sense of finality but little solace to Elaine and Corey. No amount of time will ever bring Dylan back, the judge said solemnly, but justice demands accountability. As the courtroom emptied, Elaine faced a barrage of cameras and microphones outside. Her voice trembled, but her words were resolute. Dylan's voice was finally heard today, she said. This isn't just about my son. It's about every child who deserves to be protected. Her statement resonated deeply, sparking discussions about the importance of recognizing warning signs in abusive relationships and holding perpetrators accountable. The trial's conclusion sent ripples through the small town of Vallecito and beyond. In interviews, neighbors expressed relief that the case had reached a resolution, but acknowledged the lingering scars it left on the community. It's hard to believe something this terrible happened here, one resident remarked. We'll never look at this place the same way again. A surprising twist emerged after the verdict, when a juror revealed in a post-trial interview how close the case had come to a mistrial. We were divided at first, they admitted. Some of us wanted more concrete evidence, but in the end, the circumstantial evidence in Mark's behavior couldn't be ignored. This revelation underscored the complexity of the case and the challenges faced by both the prosecution and the defense. For Mark, the sentence marked the beginning of a long, isolated existence behind bars. Despite his conviction, he maintained his innocence, filing appeals and insisting that the evidence had been misinterpreted. But his protests found little sympathy in the public eye, where he had already been condemned as a father who had failed in the most profound way. Elaine, meanwhile, channeled her grief into advocacy. She partnered with organizations focused on child safety and justice reform, using Dylan's story as a rallying cry for change. Her efforts gave purpose to her pain, inspiring others to speak out against abuse and neglect. Corey, too, found his voice, becoming a vocal supporter of his mother's mission. Together, they ensured that Dylan's legacy would not be defined solely by his tragic death, but also by the positive impact of his story. Though the trial was over, its emotional weight lingered. Elaine often visited Dylan's favorite spot by the lake, finding solace in the gentle ripples of the water. He loved it here, she said softly during a quiet moment. This is where I feel closest to him. The journey for justice had been long and harrowing, but it had brought a measure of closure. Dylan's story, though steeped in sorrow, served as a powerful reminder of the resilience of love and the unyielding pursuit of truth. The trial's conclusion marked the end of one chapter, but left lingering shadows that refused to fade. Investigators, driven by the remaining questions, began examining whether Mark acted alone in covering up Dylan's death. A new lead surfaced, hinting at a potential accomplice, someone who might have helped move Dylan's remains to Middle Mountain. The implications were both chilling and complex, suggesting that the case might not be as closed as it seemed. Elaine Hall, meanwhile, took her grief and turned it into advocacy. She partnered with child safety organizations, sharing Dylan's story to raise awareness about recognizing warning signs in toxic relationships. Her voice, once filled with sorrow, now carried determination. Dylan's legacy will be one of change, she vowed during a public event. Corey, too, found purpose in his brother's memory, using his platform to encourage families to speak out against abuse. The small town of Vallecito struggled to heal. Many residents couldn't shake the weight of the tragedy, the once idyllic mountain community now marked by its darkest hour. Murals and memorials dedicated to Dylan appeared around town, serving as both a tribute and a reminder of the fragility of trust. Then came the twist. An anonymous tip to law enforcement suggested that Mark's actions on the morning of Dylan's disappearance were seen by someone close to him. This new lead reignited the investigation, hinting at the possibility of future developments. Elaine remained steadfast in her resolve, knowing the road to justice was ongoing. She visited Middle Mountain often, leaving flowers and whispers for Dylan. "This isn't over," she said quietly, "and I won't stop until every truth is uncovered." The years that followed Mark Redwine's conviction brought waves of change, reflection, and lingering questions. For Elaine Hall, the journey to find peace had only just begun. She spent countless days working to ensure Dylan's story would not be forgotten, turning her pain into purpose. Her advocacy work with child safety organizations grew, drawing attention to the warning signs of abusive relationships and the silent struggles children face. "Dylan's voice must echo beyond this tragedy," Elaine often said, her resolve unshaken. Corey, too, found his own path of healing. He joined his mother in raising awareness, speaking at schools and community centers about the importance of trust and vigilance in families. In his speeches, he often described the brother he had lost. Dylan was more than just a victim, he'd say. He was a light in our lives, a light that we have a responsibility to keep shining. Back in Vallecito, the community struggled to reconcile its identity with the haunting shadow of Dylan's story. Murals appeared in the town square, depicting Dylan's smiling face alongside messages of hope and resilience. His memory became a part of the town's fabric, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of protecting one another. Yet the case was far from forgotten. The anonymous tip suggesting Mark had an accomplice led investigators to revisit the timeline of Dylan's disappearance. A retired detective, now working as a consultant, analyzed phone records and GPS data that had previously been overlooked. The results were startling. A new connection emerged, linking Mark to an individual who had been in the area on the morning of Dylan's disappearance. The implications were chilling, a silent participant in the cover-up who had yet to face justice. Elaine remained steadfast, though the prospect of reopening the case weighed heavily on her. "Every answer brings more questions," she admitted during a quiet moment. Still, she believed in the necessity of uncovering the whole truth. Dylan deserves that much. In one of her visits to Middle Mountain, Elaine found solace among the wildflowers growing near the site where Dylan's remains had been discovered. She brought a letter this time, carefully folded in her hand, and read it aloud as the wind carried her words. "Dear Dylan," she began, her voice steady, "I promise you, your story has changed the world, and I will keep telling it as long as I have breath." The world beyond Vallecito also grappled with the broader lessons of Dylan's tragedy. Documentaries, podcasts, and true crime series revisited the case, not as a spectacle, but as a cautionary tale. Advocates pushed for stronger legislation protecting children from familial abuse, citing Dylan's story as a catalyst for change. One particular night, Elaine sat alone by the lake Dylan had loved so much. The moonlight reflected off the water, and the silence felt almost sacred. She clutched the last photo she had of him, a snapshot of Dylan laughing, carefree and full of life. "You mattered," she whispered, her voice breaking, "and you always will." As the years passed, Elaine and Corey continued their work, driven by a shared mission to honor Dylan's legacy. The scars remained, but they became symbols of resilience rather than reminders of loss. Dylan's story was no longer just a narrative of tragedy. It was a beacon for change, a rallying cry for justice, and a reminder that even in the face of unspeakable darkness, hope could endure. What do you think of Mark Redwine and his actions? From which region are you watching this video? Share your thoughts in the comments below and rate this story from 0 to 10. What's your verdict?